Introduction. The Mirror of the Watchman. We are living in an era of unprecedented noise. We are surrounded by experts, who speak in the polished jargon of the palace, telling us that $40 trillion in debt is a sign of strength, and that the shrinking of the American dream is merely a transition. But as we stand in the year 2026, the noise is no longer working. The audience is restless. The theater is cold. To understand the crisis we are currently breathing, we must look away from the politicians and the bankers. Instead, we must look toward two figures who, though separated by 3,000 years, were masters of the same craft, the unmasking of reality. The man from the prison, Joseph the auditor. In real life, the life recorded in the foundational texts of Western civilization, Joseph was the first man to perform a forensic audit on a superpower. He was not a priest or a politician, he was an outsider. After years in a dungeon, he was brought before Pharaoh to interpret a nightmare. Joseph's genius was his ability to see through the fat cows of the present. While Egypt was feasting, Joseph was calculating. He understood that prosperity is often a timed window, a gift meant to be stored rather than consumed. He didn't offer Pharaoh a stimulus plan. He offered a silo strategy. He was the man who saved an empire not by printing money, but by counting grain. He is the archetype of the truth-teller, who values the math more than the mood of the palace. The man from the stage, the masked magician. Fast forward to the modern era. In the world of entertainment, the masked magician became a cultural phenomenon for one reason: he broke the code of silence. He was a professional who stepped onto the stage to show the audience exactly how they were being fooled. He showed the trapdoors, the mirrors, and the invisible wires. He didn't do it to destroy the wonder of the show, but to empower the audience. He believed that once you see how the trick is done, you can no longer be a victim of the illusion. In this book, the masked magician represents the forensic analyst of the modern financial system. He is the one who knows how the Federal Reserve floats the debt, how the Treasury hides the inflation, and how the experts use jargon to keep you in your seat while they empty your granary. The unified voice, the forensic watchman. This book is a collision of these two spirits. We are bringing the ancient foresight of Joseph and the modern exposure of the masked magician, and unifying them into a single voice for the present. Why? Because America is currently trapped in a magic show that has turned into a nightmare. Like Pharaoh, our leaders have had dreams of lean cows, the warnings of 2008 and 2020. But unlike Pharaoh, our leaders did not listen to the man from the prison. They listened to the magicians. By unifying these voices, we create a perspective that is both timeless and immediate. Joseph provides the cycle, the 12-chapter movement of plenty to famine, while the masked magician provides the evidence, the unmasking of the 2026 debt tricks. Together, they form a forensic watchman. They stand before the reader not to sell a political party or a financial product, but to provide an interpretation. They are here to show you that the 2026 debt bomb is not an accident of history, it is the logical conclusion of a trick that has finally run out of time. The mirror of regret. As you turn these pages, you will see a tragic contrast emerge. You will see that ancient Egypt, with its primitive tools and stone silos, survived a famine because its leader had the humility to face the math. You will see that modern America, with its supercomputers and digital ledgers, is failing because its leaders preferred the illusion to the truth. The Joseph voice is the last voice heard when the music stops. The masked magician is the one who turns on the house lights. Together, they are here to tell you, the show is over. The wires are visible. It is time to look at the silo. The interpretation is one. The matter is established. Welcome to the reveal. Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Mask. The stage is dark. For 50 years, the spotlight has been fixed on a single dazzling performance. The audience, 300 million strong, has been mesmerized by the Great American Prosperity Act. We watched as trillions of dollars were pulled from empty hats. We cheered as the laws of financial gravity were seemingly suspended, allowing a nation to float on a cloud of infinite credit without ever hitting the ground. But in the wings, a figure has been watching the wires. He is not a politician looking for your vote. He is not a magician from the Federal Reserve trying to convince you that your shrinking grocery bag is actually full. He is an outsider. He wears a mask not to hide his identity, but to ensure you focus on the math rather than the man. To understand the 2026 debt bomb, we have to understand the archetype of this voice. We call him Joseph, the forensic analyst of cycles. Thousands of years ago, Joseph was the first man to perform a forensic audit on a superpower. He didn't come from the Ivy League or the Egyptian priesthood. He came from a prison cell. When he stood before Pharaoh, he didn't offer a stimulus package or a new economic theory. He offered an interpretation. He looked at the fat cows of the Nile, the period of unprecedented abundance, and he didn't see a permanent state of glory. He saw a window of time. Joseph's genius wasn't in predicting the future, it was in recognizing the cycle. He understood that in a world of finite resources, a season of plenty is not a right, it is a preparation phase. He was the only man in the palace who understood that the fat cows were eventually going to be eaten by the lean ones. The view from the 2026 prison. In our modern story, the Joseph voice is the one that has been locked away in the prison of irrelevance for the last 2 decades. In 2010, when the debt was a mere $13 trillion, voices warned that the silo was being emptied. The magicians laughed. In 2020, when the debt surged toward $25 trillion, the voices warned that the lean cows were approaching. The magicians performed a new trick called quantitative easing and told the audience to go back to sleep. By April 2026, the debt has crossed $39 trillion. The interest payments alone are now a $1 trillion weight around the neck of the American dream. The prisoners, those who spoke the truth about the math, are finally being brought before Pharaoh. Not because Pharaoh wants to hear them, but because the magicians have run out of tricks. The purpose of the mask. The masked magician walks onto the stage today to do exactly what Joseph did: turn on the house lights. When the house lights come up, the magic disappears. You see the frayed cables holding up the stock market. You see the trapdoor where your purchasing power vanished. You see that the fat cows were actually just papier-mâché, and the lean cows of inflation and debt service are real, hungry, and standing in your living room. Joseph is the man who tells you that the dream is over, but the reality is just beginning. He is the voice that declares, the interpretation is not a matter of opinion. The math is fixed. The doubling of the warning has passed. Now we look at the silo. This book is the report from that audit. It is the unmasking of the performance. Before we can talk about the famine, we must first understand the man who had the courage to tell the king that his magicians were nothing more than actors in a play that has finally reached its final act. The show is over. The mask is on. The truth is next. Chapter 2. The stage is set. The 50-year performance. Every great illusion requires a long lead-in, a period where the audience is conditioned to believe that what they are seeing is normal. For America, that lead-in lasted 5 decades. Joseph would call this our 7 years of plenty, but the masked magician calls it the greatest period of misdirection in human history. To understand the 2026 debt bomb, we must first look at the fat cows that grazed in the American pasture from the mid-1970s until the curtain began to twitch. The era of the golden harvest. In the ancient dream, the 7 fat cows were sleek, healthy, and emerged from the Nile, the lifeblood of the empire. America's Nile was the global reserve currency. Because the world traded in dollars, we possessed a magic granary that never seemed to empty. Joseph would interpret the years between 1975 and 2025 as a unique window of geopolitical grace. During this half-century, America enjoyed a harvest of 3 pillars. The peace dividend. We spent decades as the world's sole superpower, allowing us to build a global trade network that brought cheap goods to every doorstep. The technology boom. We digitized the world, creating paper wealth that moved at the speed of light. The demographic sweet spot. A massive workforce, the baby boomers was at the height of its productivity, filling the tax coffers and creating the illusion of a permanent surplus. During these years, the magicians in Washington and on Wall Street told us that this was not a season, but a permanent plateau. They told us that the harvest would never end, and therefore we didn't need to store anything. Consumption as a virtue. In Joseph's Egypt, the purpose of the plenty was storage. In modern America, the purpose of the plenty was leverage. The masked magician reveals the first great wire. We didn't just eat the harvest, we borrowed against the harvests of our grandchildren. Instead of building a silo of capital, paying down debt and investing in infrastructure that would last centuries, we built a silo of credit. We began to treat debt as if it were income. The magicians convinced us that as long as the cows looked fat, it didn't matter that they were owned by someone else. We were living in a mansion with a lion on every brick, yet we walked through the halls as if we owned the land. The warning in the wind. Even in the height of the plenty, there were signs that the season was changing. Joseph, standing in the corner of the palace, would have pointed to the 1990s and early 2000s as the moment the cows began to lose their luster. The trade deficits grew. The manufacturing base, the actual planting of the grain, was moved overseas. The paper silos of the stock market became more important than the actual granaries of production. The magicians, however, were master performers. Every time the audience felt a chill of reality, the magicians would pump more liquidity into the room. They lowered interest rates. They loosened credit. They made the fat cows look even larger by inflating them with air. The interpretation, a window, not a room. The masked magician stands before you now to deliver the hard interpretation of Chapter 2. The last 50 years were not the American way. They were an anomaly. Joseph's voice declares that the plenty was a strategic gift meant to prepare us for the lean. It was a time to fix the roof while the sun was shining. Instead, we sold the shingles to pay for a bigger television. By the time we reached the mid-2020s, the 7 years, the 50-year era of easy growth had expired. The sun was beginning to set on the dollar's absolute rule, the workforce was retiring, and the peace dividend was being spent on new conflicts. The stage was set. The audience was still clapping, expecting another encore of easy money. But behind the curtain, the magicians were sweating. They knew the fat cows were exhausted. They knew the silo was filled with nothing but IOUs. The season of plenty was over. The season of the lean cow was knocking on the door, and for the first time in 50 years, the magicians had no more mirrors to hide it. Chapter 3. Meet the magicians. The architects of the dream. In every great magic show, the audience's attention is held by the performer in the tuxedo, the one with the confident smile and the steady hand. In the American debt illusion, these are the magicians of the palace, the chairs of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury secretaries, and the expert economists who fill the airwaves with complex spells of jargon. Joseph would have recognized them instantly. They are the modern version of Pharaoh's wise men, men paid to tell the king that the dream isn't a warning but a promise of his own greatness. The language of the spell. The first trick of the magician is the vocal illusion. They use words designed to sound like science but function like a sedative. They don't say, "We are printing money because we are broke." They say quantitative easing. They don't say your savings are being eaten by debt. They say targeted inflationary targets. The masked magician pulls back the curtain on this language. He reveals that these terms are not meant to inform you, they are meant to disarm you. As long as you believe the economy is too complex for a common person to understand, you will continue to trust the magicians even as your bushel of grain gets smaller every year. The motive: keeping the audience in the seat. Why do the magicians keep the illusion going? It isn't always because they are villainous, it's because their power depends on the dream continuing. In Joseph's time, if the magicians admitted a famine was coming, the people would stop feasting and start hoarding. The economy would stall. The king would lose his glory. Similarly, our modern magicians are trapped by their own performance. If they tell the truth, that the $39 trillion debt is a terminal weight, the stock market crashes, the magic money stops flowing, and the audience leaves the theater. The blindness of the palace. The most dangerous thing about the magicians is that they eventually begin to believe their own tricks. They convince themselves that because they could print $1, they could create wealth. Joseph's voice delivers the forensic truth: you cannot print grain. You can print 1 million grain coupons, but if the silo is empty, the coupons are just paper. The magicians mistook the representation of value for value itself. By April 2026, the magicians have reached a terrifying moment in the show. Usually, when a trick goes wrong, they just use a smoke bomb, a new stimulus package, or a rate cut to reset the stage. But the smoke is clearing, and the audience is starting to see the trapdoors. The interpretation: the experts are part of the dream. The masked magician reveals the final secret of Chapter 3. You cannot look to the magicians to interpret the debt bomb, because they are the ones who built it. To ask a central banker when the debt will become a problem is like asking the man sawing the woman in half if the saw is sharp. He will always tell you the performance is safe, right up until the moment it isn't. Joseph was called from the prison, not the palace, because only an outsider can see the palace for what it really is, a house of cards built on the hope that no one ever opens the window. The magicians are architects of the dream. Joseph is the messenger of the dawn. And as the sun rises on 2026, the magicians are finding that their magic words no longer have the power to keep the lean cows at bay. The tuxedo is frayed. The hat is empty. The magicians are out of time. Chapter 4. Trick number 1: the invisible wire. The zero-interest illusion. If you have ever seen a magician make a heavy object float in midair, you know the first thing you do is look for the wires. You squint, trying to catch a glint of nylon or steel against the velvet curtain. For nearly 2 decades, the American economy was that floating object. Trillions of dollars in debt were suspended above our heads, and the audience marveled that it didn't come crashing down. The masked magician now steps forward to show you the wire. It was called ZIRP, Zero Interest Rate Policy. The gravity-defying act. In the real world, debt has weight. That weight is called interest. Usually, the more you borrow, the heavier the burden becomes, until you eventually can't carry it anymore and you fall. This is the law of financial gravity. But the magicians found a way to cut gravity. By artificially forcing interest rates to near zero, they made the interest cow invisible. They told the nation, "Look, we have borrowed $10 trillion, $20 trillion, $30 trillion, and it doesn't hurt. The payments are lower than they were 20 years ago." Joseph, watching from the wings, would have seen the danger immediately. He knew that the wire wasn't making the debt go away, it was just hiding the mass. The cost of the illusion to keep the debt floating. The magicians had to sacrifice the silo of the common man. They destroyed the incentive to save. They forced the elderly to gamble in the stock market because their savings accounts paid nothing. They allowed the government to spend without consequence because the credit card had a 0% introductory rate that lasted for 15 years. The audience thought they were watching a miracle of modern monetary theory. The masked magician reveals the truth: it was a trapdoor. By making debt free, the magicians encouraged the nation to gorge itself on the fat cows of credit, ensuring that when gravity eventually returned, the crash would be terminal. The wire snaps. By 2024 and 2025, the illusion began to fail. Inflation, the natural consequence of printing paper grain, forced the magicians to raise interest rates. Suddenly, the invisible wire became visible, and it was glowing red hot. The masked magician points to the 2026 reality. Every time the interest rate goes up by 1%, the weight of the debt increases by hundreds of billions of dollars. The debt hasn't moved, but the gravity has returned. The interpretation: you cannot borrow time. Joseph's voice delivers the forensic unmasking. A loan at 0% interest is not a gift, it is a lure. The magicians used the invisible wire to convince America that we could have plenty without storage. They tricked Pharaoh into thinking he didn't need a silo because he could just keep borrowing grain from the future at no cost. But the future has arrived. In April 2026, the introductory period is over. The bill for the magic show has come due, and the interest payments are now eating the very foundations of the state. The wire didn't make the debt bomb disappear, it just ensured that we were standing directly under it when it finally fell. The wire is broken. Gravity is back. And the lean cow of interest is starving. Chapter 5. Trick number 2: the mirror box of GDP. In the world of professional illusion, the mirror box is a classic. It's a simple cabinet lined with mirrors that reflects the empty sides back to the audience, making it appear as though the box is full of treasure when, in reality, the treasure has been removed and the space is empty. For the last decade, the magicians have used the American economy as a giant mirror box. They point to a soaring gross domestic product, GDP, and tell the audience, look at the wealth. Look at the growth. The fat cows are bigger than ever. The masked magician now steps forward to show you how the mirrors are angled. The illusion of growth. GDP is supposed to be the measure of a nation's harvest, the total value of everything we produce and sell. When GDP goes up, we are told the nation is getting richer. But Joseph, the forensic auditor, would ask a single devastating question: where did the seed for this harvest come from? The masked magician reveals the trick. In 2026, our growth is actually liquidation. For years, the magicians have been borrowing trillions of dollars to stimulate the economy. When that borrowed money is spent, it shows up in the GDP numbers. If the government borrows $2 trillion and spends it on social programs or infrastructure, the GDP grows by $2 trillion. The audience cheers. But the mirrors are hiding the back of the box, the $2 trillion debt that was created to make that growth happen. The math of the abyss. The masked magician pulls the mirrors out of the box to show the audience the true math of 2026. To get $1 of economic growth, America is now forced to borrow over $2.50 in new debt. Imagine a farmer who brags about a record harvest of 1,000 bushels, but hides the fact that he had to borrow 2,500 bushels from his neighbor just to plant the field. This isn't a harvest, it's a debt trap. The fat cow the magicians are showing you is actually a hollow shell, held up by the very debt that is destined to destroy it. We are growing our way into bankruptcy. The interpretation, consuming the seed. Joseph's voice delivers the unmasking. You have mistaken the fire for the sun. A fire provides light and warmth, but it does so by consuming the very structure of the house. The magicians have set the silo on fire to create a glow of prosperity. They are telling you the house is bright, while Joseph is telling you the walls are disappearing. By April 2026, the mirror box is starting to crack. The debt has become so massive that even the most creative accounting can no longer hide the fact that the growth is a phantom. The audience is beginning to realize that you cannot create a season of plenty by simply writing larger numbers on a ledger. The bowing of the logic. Joseph explains that in Egypt the grain was real. It could be touched, stored and eaten. In America, our wealth has become a reflection in a mirror, a digital number that only exists as long as everyone agrees not to look behind the curtain. The masked magician concludes Chapter 5 with a warning. When the mirrors break, the audience doesn't just see an empty box. They see the debt bomb that was hidden behind the glass. And in 2026, the cracks are reaching the edges of the frame. The box is empty. The mirrors are shattered. The fat cow was a ghost. Chapter 6. Trick number 3. The vanishing dollar. The sleight of hand. In the repertoire of the magicians, there is no trick more ancient or more devastating than the vanishing act. Usually, it involves a coin disappearing from a hand, or a bird vanishing from a cage. But in the grand performance of the American debt illusion, the magicians have made something much larger disappear: the value of your labor. The masked magician now steps forward to reveal the sleight of hand behind inflation. The illusion of the full basket. The magicians tell the audience that a little bit of inflation is a sign of a healthy economy. They point to your paycheck, which has grown over the years, and they tell you that you are wealthier than your parents were. This is the full basket illusion. But Joseph, the forensic auditor, doesn't look at the number of bills in your hand. He looks at the weight of the grain those bills can buy. He reveals that while the magicians were handing you more paper coupons, they were secretly shrinking the size of your bushel basket. The sleight of hand. Devaluation as a policy. How is the trick done? The masked magician shows you the double bottom of the currency. The printing press. To pay for the $39 trillion debt, the magicians must create money out of thin air. The dilution. Every new dollar printed makes the dollars in your pocket worth less. It is a silent tax that doesn't require a vote in Congress. The CPI puppet. To keep the audience from panicking, the magicians use a rigged measurement called the Consumer Price Index. When the price of steak gets too high, they swap it for hamburger in their basket and tell you inflation is low. Why the trick is necessary. The masked magician reveals the darkest secret of the performance. The magicians need the dollar to vanish. If the government owes $39 trillion, the only way they can ever pay it back is by making the dollar so worthless that $39 trillion feels like pocket change. They are trying to inflate their way out of the debt bomb. But there is a victim in this trick: anyone who worked, saved, or played by the rules. The magicians are essentially burning your silo to heat the palace. The interpretation, the false scales. Joseph's voice delivers the unmasking from the ancient laws. A false balance is an abomination. In Egypt, a measure of grain was a physical reality. You couldn't inflate a harvest. But in 2026, our leaders have disconnected value from reality. They have replaced the silo of grain with a digital mirage. Joseph points out that by making the dollar vanish, the magicians have broken the social contract. When the people can no longer trust that the grain they store today will be there tomorrow, they stop planting. They stop building. They stop believing in the dream. The reveal: the trick fails at the grocery store. By April 2026, the sleight of hand has become too obvious to ignore. The magicians can no longer hide the wires of inflation behind complex jargon. When a lean cow, a basic bag of groceries, costs more than a day's labor, the audience stops clapping. The masked magician concludes Chapter 6 with a final reveal: the dollar didn't just lose value by accident, it was sacrificed to keep the debt bomb from exploding. But a nation cannot live on disappearing money any more than a man can eat a disappearing rabbit. The hand is faster than the eye, but it is not faster than the stomach. The paper silo is empty. Chapter 7. The First Nightmare. 2008 and the Forgotten Lesson. Every disaster has a dress rehearsal. In the ancient story, Pharaoh didn't just have one dream, he had a series of warnings. Before the final collapse, there is always a moment where the lean cows first appear on the horizon to see if the watchmen are awake. For America, that first nightmare was 2008. The masked magician now steps forward to show how the magicians use that crisis, not to fix the silo, but to build a bigger stage for an even more dangerous trick. The warning shot. In 2008, the paper silo of the housing market collapsed. For a brief moment, the house lights flickered, and the audience saw the truth: the nation was living on a mountain of bad debt. The lean cows had arrived, and they were hungry. Joseph, looking back at this era, would have seen it as the first dream. It was the moment of mercy, a chance for the nation to admit the harvest was failing and to start storing real grain, fiscal discipline. It was the moment to stop the magic and return to the math. The bailout sleight of hand. But the magicians of the palace panicked. They realized that if they allowed the lean cows to eat, the show would be over. So they performed the bailout trick. The injection: they printed trillions of dollars to save the very banks that had emptied the silo. The sedative: they lowered interest rates to zero to keep the audience from feeling the pain of the crash. The result: instead of clearing out the debt, they socialized it, moving it from the private ledgers onto the public debt of the United States. The masked magician reveals the forensic truth of 2008. We didn't solve the problem, we just moved the debt bomb to a higher shelf. We traded a bank crisis for a sovereign crisis. We ignored the warning of the first dream and doubled down on the illusion. The silence of the watchman. In Joseph's time, a man who gave a false interpretation of a dream was cast out. In modern America, the magicians who failed to see 2008 coming were given promotions. They told the public that the magic had worked. They bragged that they had saved the world. But Joseph points out the fatal flaw: you cannot cure a debt problem with more debt. By saving the system with printed money, the magicians ensured that the next nightmare would be twice as large. They used the 7 years of plenty that followed 2010 to 2017 to pile up even more debt, assuming the lean cows would never return. The interpretation: a lesson refused. The masked magician delivers the unmasking of Chapter 7. The first nightmare was a gift that was spurned. 2008 was the universe giving America a controlled burn to prevent a forest fire. But the magicians put out the fire and allowed the deadwood of debt to keep stacking up. Joseph's voice declares that when you ignore the first dream, the second dream becomes fixed and certain. Because the magicians refused to listen in 2008, the 2026 debt bomb became a mathematical inevitability. We didn't learn to build a silo, we just learned how to hide the hunger for a few more years. The first nightmare was the warning. The second nightmare is the reality. And this time, there is no one left to bail out the magicians. Chapter 8. The Second Nightmare. 2026, and the doubling of the dream. In the ancient record, Joseph explained a terrifying principle of the spiritual and physical world. The dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. The first dream is a warning, the second dream is a decree. For America, the first dream was 2008. The second dream is the period we are living through right now in 2026. The masked magician now steps forward to show you why this nightmare is different from the last. The doubling of the debt. In 2008, the national debt was roughly $10 trillion. It was a lean cow, but it was manageable. By 2026, the debt has not just grown, it has quadrupled. We are now staring at $39 trillion. Joseph points out the doubling effect. When a warning is ignored, the reality that follows is twice as intense. In 2008, the magicians could still print their way out because the world still believed in the magic. In 2026, the magic has been used so many times that the audience has grown cynical. The currency has been diluted, the silos are empty, and the lean cows have returned, not as shadows but as the dominant force in the room. The fixed matter. The masked magician reveals the most sobering truth of the second dream. The time for fixing the debt has officially expired. In the first nightmare, there was still a window to build a silo. There was still a way to cut spending, raise interest rates slowly, and return to a gold standard mindset. But because the magicians used that window to perform more tricks, the matter is now fixed. In 2026, the debt is growing faster than the economy can possibly recover. We are adding $1 trillion to the debt every few months. Joseph's voice declares that this is no longer a problem to be solved, it is a cycle to be endured. The nightmare has become the reality. The vanishing exit. During the first nightmare, the magicians pointed to the exit sign. They promised that once the emergency is over, we would return to normal. They lied. The emergency became the permanent state of the theater. The masked magician shows the audience the exits in 2026. The tax exit, taxing the rich wouldn't even cover the interest payments. The growth exit, as shown in Chapter 5, we are borrowing $2.50 to grow $1. The spending cut exit, the lean cows of Social Security and Medicare are now so large they cannot be moved without the stage collapsing. The interpretation, the arrival of the shortly. Joseph's voice delivers the final unmasking of Chapter 8, the shortly has arrived. When the dream is doubled, it means the time for talk is over. The debt bomb is no longer a theoretical threat for our grandchildren. It is the lived experience of the 2026 worker, the 2026 retiree, and the 2026 taxpayer. The magicians are still waving their wands, but the lean cows are already eating the velvet curtains. Joseph warns that the doubling of the nightmare is a sign of finality. You can ignore a warning, but you cannot ignore a decree of math. The second dream has ended, and the nation is waking up to find that the lean years aren't coming, they are already here. The warning was 2008. The reality is 2026. The matter is fixed. Chapter 9. The lean cow in the budget. The interest eclipse. In the ancient dream, the most terrifying detail was not just that the lean cows appeared, but what they did. The lean and the ill-favored kind did eat up the first 7 fat kine. The lean cows didn't just stand alongside the fat ones, they consumed them entirely. The masked magician now steps forward to reveal the hungriest, lean cow in the 2026 American landscape. It is not the military. It is not the social safety net. It is the interest on the national debt. The moment of the eclipse. For decades, the cost of borrowing money was a background noise in the federal budget, a small, manageable expense hidden in the fine print. But as we enter 2026, a mathematical eclipse has occurred. For the first time in history, the amount of tax money required just to pay the interest on our debt has surpassed the cost of our national defense. The masked magician turns on the house lights to show the audience the carnage. We are spending more to rent the money we already spent than we are to protect the borders of the nation. The interest is now eating the fat cows of our infrastructure, our education, and our future. The refinance war. How did the cow get so hungry so fast? The masked magician reveals the refinance war. Remember the invisible wires from Chapter 4. The magicians borrowed trillions at 0% and 1% interest. But those loans weren't permanent, they were short-term. In 2026, trillions of dollars of that cheap debt are coming due. To pay them back, the government has to borrow new money, but at 5% or 6% interest. The masked magician shows the audience the trap. We are now borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. This is the death spiral of the silo. The lean cow is no longer just eating the harvest, it is eating the farmer. The cannibalization of the state. Joseph, the forensic auditor, would point out that a nation that spends its primary strength on its past, interest, has no strength left for its future. The past, the $39 trillion we already spent. The future, innovation, energy, and the next generation. By 2026, the interest eclipse means that every new tax dollar you send to Washington is consumed before it can ever be used to build a road, heal a patient, or launch a satellite. The lean cow of interest is a black hole in the center of the budget, and it is growing larger every hour. The interpretation, the past is eating the future. Joseph's voice delivers the unmasking. Your debt has become your master. In Egypt, the famine was survived because they had grain in the storehouse. In America, we have a storehouse of IOUs. Joseph points out that interest is non-discretionary. It must be paid, or the whole magic show collapses instantly. The magicians are now in a panic. They cannot cut the interest cow. They cannot print it away without making the currency vanish. Chapter 6. They are forced to watch as the most productive nation in history becomes a servant to its own compounding math. The masked magician concludes Chapter 9 with the most sobering reveal of all. The lean cows are no longer a threat for tomorrow. They are at the table today, and they are eating the very last of the grain. The eclipse is total. The past has consumed the future. The math has no mercy. Chapter 10. The magician's hat is empty. Every magic show eventually reaches its final act. The audience has been entertained, the invisible wires have held, and the mirror box has reflected a false abundance for decades. But there is a moment every performer fears, the moment the props stop working. In April 2026, The masked magician pulls back the velvet curtain to reveal a startling sight. The magicians are reaching into their top hats for one last stimulus or one more bailout, but the hat is empty. The global exit. For 50 years, the greatest prop in the American magic show was the rest of the world. Other nations, the neighboring kingdoms, were required to use our dollars and buy our debt. They were the ones who filled our paper silo with their hard work and real goods. But as the debt bomb ticks louder, the neighbors are no longer clapping. Joseph, the forensic auditor, looks at the global ledger and sees the great exit. The flight to hard assets. Central banks across the globe are no longer stockpiling the paper grain of the US dollar. They are buying gold at record rates. The end of petrodollars. The world is finding ways to trade energy without the magician's currency. The masked magician shows the audience the truth. The trick only worked as long as the world believed the American silo was full. Now that they can see the debt through the cracks, they are walking toward the exits. The refinance crisis. The magician's most reliable trick was refinancing, paying off old debt by issuing new debt. It's like a man paying one credit card with another. But in 2026, the new credit card has a limit. When the government tries to sell trillions in new bonds to cover the interest eclipse, Chapter 9, they find fewer buyers. To attract anyone, they have to raise interest rates even higher. This creates a feedback loop of doom. Every attempt to fix the problem makes the debt bomb bigger. The magicians are now sweating under the stage lights because they've realized you cannot borrow your way out of a debt trap. The vanishing audience. Domestically, the audience is also leaving. The common man, the one who worked and saved, realizes the vanishing dollar, Chapter 6, has left him with nothing. The trust that held the theater together is dissolving. People are moving their grain into assets the magicians cannot touch: land, precious metals, and real skills. The interpretation: the neighbors are full, but we are empty. Joseph's voice delivers the unmasking. The famine is not just in your house, it is a famine of trust. In Egypt, the neighboring nations came to Joseph because he had the grain. In 2026, the world is fleeing from the magicians because they only have coupons for grain that doesn't exist. Joseph points out that the magician's hat didn't run out of money, it ran out of credibility. You can print numbers on paper, but you cannot print the belief that those numbers are worth anything. Once that belief vanishes, the paper silo becomes a pile of trash. The masked magician concludes Chapter 10 with the most haunting reveal. The show isn't ending because the magicians decided to stop. It's ending because the world has stopped watching. The props are broken, the neighbors are gone, and the hat is empty. The illusion of infinite credit has met the reality of a finite world. The applause has died. The silence has begun. Chapter 11. The Pharaoh Who Listened. The Mirror of Regret. In the final movements of a tragedy, there is often a mirror scene, a moment where the protagonist sees what they could have been if they had made a different choice. For America in 2026, that mirror is ancient Egypt. The masked magician now steps forward to deliver the most painful unmasking of the entire book. It is not an unmasking of a trick, but an unmasking of character. He points to the historic record and asks the haunting question: why did a primitive kingdom survive a famine that is currently breaking the most advanced nation on earth? The humility of the throne. Joseph reminds us that when he stood before Pharaoh, he was a nobody, a Hebrew prisoner with no degree in economics and no seat at the political table. Pharaoh was the most powerful man in the world, an absolute monarch who was considered a god. But Pharaoh did something the modern magicians refused to do: he listened. When Joseph revealed the lean cows, Pharaoh didn't hire a PR firm to spin the news. He didn't ask his wise men to adjust the data to make the cows look fatter. He didn't launch a stimulus program to keep the people feasting for one more year. He accepted the hard truth of the cycle. He admitted his own magicians were powerless, and handed the keys of the kingdom to the man who spoke the truth. The Great Divergence. The Masked Magician reveals the tragic contrast of the 2010 to 2026 period. Egypt's response: during their 7 years of plenty, they taxed 20% of the grain. They didn't spend it, they stored it. They built massive stone silos. They prepared for the lean by sacrificing the now. America's response: during our window of grace, we did the opposite. We didn't store 20%, we spent 120%. We used the years of low interest and global peace to double our debt. We took the grain of the future and burned it to power the magic show of the present. The Mirror of Regret shows that Pharaoh saved Egypt because he prioritized the silo over his ego. America is failing because our magicians prioritize the performance over the people. The cost of the closed ear. Joseph's voice becomes a forensic autopsy of missed opportunities. He points to specific years: 2010, 2015, 2020, when the dream was clear and the warnings were loud. If you had listened in 2010, Joseph declares, your debt was manageable. You could have built a silo of gold and infrastructure that would have made you invulnerable. But you chose the magician. You chose the man who told you the fat cows would never die. The interpretation, the arrogance of the modern. Joseph's voice delivers the stinging unmasking of chapter 11. Your technology made you fast, but your arrogance made you deaf. In the ancient world, people knew they were subject to the laws of nature and cycles. In the modern world, the magicians convinced the nation that we were above cycles. They thought they could command the Nile to flow forever. The tragic truth is that Egypt ended their famine as the wealthiest nation on earth because they held the only real assets. America is entering its famine with a mountain of paper and a closed ear. The Masked Magician concludes this chapter with the ultimate revelation. The difference between salvation and servitude isn't the size of the famine, it's the willingness to believe the man who tells you the rain is going to stop. Pharaoh listened and lived. America didn't, and now the silo is empty. The mirror doesn't lie. The opportunity was there. The choice was ours. Chapter 12. The Silence of the Silo. Life after the show. The house lights are fully up. The magicians have fled the stage, leaving behind their hollow hats, their frayed wires and their shattered mirrors. For the first time in 50 years, the theater is quiet. The music of the Great American Prosperity Act has stopped, and in its place is a heavy, ringing silence. This is the final declaration of the Masked Magician. This is not a chapter of 10 steps to fix the economy, or how to save your portfolio. Those are the promises of the magicians. Joseph does not offer a new trick, he offers a description of reality. The reality of the empty granary. In the ancient story, the famine eventually reached a point where money failed. The record says, "And when money failed in the land of Egypt, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph." The Masked Magician reveals the final stage of the 2026 debt bomb, the stage where the paper dies. When the debt reaches $39 trillion and the interest eclipses the state, the dollar ceases to be a tool of growth and becomes a chain of servitude. We are entering the silence of the silo, a period where we must face the fact that we consumed our future before it arrived. The end of the something-for-nothing era. For 5 decades, the American psyche was built on the belief that we could have a harvest without planting, and a silo without storing. The Joseph voice, declares that this psychological illusion is the first thing that must be buried. We must learn the difference between price and value. We must learn that a nation's strength is not measured by its credit limit, but by its production. The silence of 2026 is the sound of a nation realizing that the magicians were never actually creating wealth, they were just rearranging the furniture in a burning house. The transformation of the people. Joseph's final interpretation is the most profound. The famine is the teacher. In Egypt, the famine forced the people to reorganize their lives around what was essential. It stripped away the vanity of the palace and forced everyone to look at the grain. In America, the lean years will be the era of the great simplification. The debt bomb is the explosion that clears the field of the magic tricks, so that we can finally see the soil again. The era of the paper asset is being replaced by the era of the real asset. The era of the financial engineer is being replaced by the era of the actual engineer. The final declaration. The masked magician stands at the edge of the stage and removes his mask. He is not a savior, and he is not a doom-monger. He is a witness. He looks at the audience and delivers the final forensic truth. The famine did not begin when the rain stopped. It began when you stopped listening to the man who told you the rain was a gift, not a right. The 2026 debt bomb was not an act of God, it was an act of the magicians. But the recovery, the building of the new silo, will be an act of the people. It will require the humility of the Pharaoh who listened, and the discipline of the Joseph who stored. The book ends not with a happily ever after, but with a beginning. The show is over. The wires are gone. The silo is empty. Now finally, we can start the honest work of planting again. The interpretation is finished. The matter is established. Chapter 13. The Watchman. The voices the palace ignored. In the ancient record, Joseph was not the only one who saw the famine coming. He was simply the only one the king finally decided to believe. Since the turn of the millennium, America has had its own Josephs, men and women who stepped out of the prison of irrelevance to shout a warning to a nation that was too busy feasting to listen. The masked magician now steps forward to name the most important watchman who, since the year 2000, tried to unmask the great fiscal illusion. 1. Ron Paul, the monetary prophet. If there is a modern Joseph who warned about the vanishing dollar, Chapter 6, before anyone else, it is Ron Paul. Entering the 2000s, he stood on the floor of Congress and delivered a consistent forensic message: you cannot print wealth. He warned that by abandoning the gold standard, the actual grain for paper magic, the magicians were ensuring a day of reckoning where the debt would explode and the currency would fail. He was treated as a relic of the past by the palace, but in 2026, his warnings look like a map of the present. 2. David Walker, the sovereign auditor. In 2007, as the first nightmare, Chapter 7, was brewing, David Walker, then the Comptroller General of the United States, did something unprecedented. He launched a fiscal wake-up tour. He stood before the American people and declared that the government's $50 trillion in long-term obligations was unconstitutional, unethical, and immoral. He compared the U.S. to the Roman Empire in its decline, spending more than it earned while its magicians pretended the silo was full. 3. Peter Schiff, the 2008 harbinger. Before the invisible wire snapped in 2008, Peter Schiff was the man the magicians laughed at most. On every major network he explained that the housing market was a mirror box, Chapter 5, built on bad debt. He warned that the bailouts of 2008 wouldn't fix the problem, but would simply move the debt bomb to the government's ledger. He accurately predicted that the lean cows of 2008 would return in 2026 as a sovereign debt crisis. 4. Nassim Taleb, the Black Swan analyst. In 2007, Nassim Taleb published The Black Swan, a manual on how the magician's risk models were actually fragile traps. He warned that the financial system was anti-fragile in reverse. It was designed to look stable right up until the moment it shattered. He correctly identified that debt is fragility. He told the world that a system built on $30+ trillion of leverage is a system waiting for a single spark to explode. 5. Ray Dalio, the student of cycles. As we approached the 2020s, Ray Dalio, one of the world's most successful investors, began to speak in the language of Joseph. He identified the big cycle, a 75-year pattern of debt, money printing and internal conflict that precedes the collapse of an empire. In early 2026, he delivered the $12 trillion warning, pointing out that the US is now in a debt-death spiral, where it must borrow money just to pay the interest on its past. The interpretation, the rejection of the messenger. The masked magician reveals the common thread between all these watchmen. The palace rejected them because their truth ruined the show. To listen to Ron Paul was to stop the spending. To listen to David Walker was to admit the silo was empty. To listen to Peter Schiff was to stop the magic money. Joseph's voice delivers the final unmasking of Chapter 13. A nation that kills its watchmen will eventually be killed by its enemies. These figures provided the doubling of the warning, Chapter 8. They were the evidence that the 2026 debt bomb was not a black swan event. It was a white swan, visible to everyone who was willing to look past the magician's cape. The watchmen have spoken. The record is clear. The only question remains, why are we only listening now? Chapter 14. The High Priests of the Temple. The Fed chairs unmasked. In ancient Egypt, the priesthood controlled the Nile's measurements. If the priests said the river was rising, the people celebrated. If they said it was falling, the people fasted. In modern America, the Federal Reserve chairs are our high priests. They control the Nile of liquidity. The masked magician now steps forward to perform a forensic audit on the 4 individuals who have held the wand since the year 2000. He will show you who kept the mirror box, Chapter 5, running and who tried, however briefly, to warn the king. 1. Alan Greenspan, the architect of the illusion. Greenspan was the maestro who perfected the invisible wire, Chapter 4. He entered the 2000s, having convinced the world that he could fine-tune the economy forever. The trick: every time the market wobbled, he lowered interest rates, creating a safety net that encouraged massive debt. The unmasking: he later admitted a flaw in his ideology, but by then the lean cows of the 2008 crisis were already at the door. He was the one who taught the palace that they never had to stop feasting. 2. Ben Bernanke, the printing press priest. When the first nightmare, Chapter 7, hit in 2008, Bernanke didn't just perform a trick, he rewrote the laws of magic. The trick: he introduced quantitative easing, the literal printing of billions of dollars to buy government debt. He told the audience it was temporary. The cover-up: he insisted that the fat cows of the housing market were contained right until the moment they died. He saved the banks, but he did it by doubling the weight of the debt bomb for the next generation. 3. Janet Yellen, the guard of the status quo. Yellen was the caretaker magician. Her role was to ensure the mirror box didn't shatter after the 2008 crisis. The trick: she kept interest rates near zero for almost her entire tenure, ensuring the debt eclipse, Chapter 9, stayed hidden. The truth: delayed Interestingly, once she left the Fed and became Treasury Secretary, her tune shifted. In 2026, we look back at her era as the quiet before the storm, where the magicians knew the hat was empty but kept reaching inside anyway. 4. Jerome Powell, the man who saw the grave. Of all the high priests, Jerome Powell is the one who has come closest to speaking the Joseph voice. The moment of truth. In early 2024 and 2025, Powell began to do something his predecessors wouldn't. He told the public that the U.S. was on an unsustainable fiscal path. He admitted that the debt was growing faster than the economy. The trap: while he told the truth with his words, his hands were still tied to the wand. He was forced to print more money to fund the $39 trillion debt, even as he warned that it would lead to the 2026 explosion. He is the tragic magician, the one who knows the bridge is out but is still driving the train. The interpretation, the priesthood of paper. Joseph's voice delivers the final unmasking. The priests of the palace cannot save the people because they serve the king's debt, not the people's grain. Joseph points out that the Fed chairs are not independent, they are the debt servants. If they stop the magic, the government goes bankrupt. If they continue the magic, the dollar vanishes. By 2026, the Fed chairs have run out of magic words. They are no longer priests of prosperity, they are the coroners of the currency. The reveal: the wand is broken. The masked magician concludes this final chapter by showing the audience the wand, interest rate control. In 2026, the wand is broken. If they lower rates to save the economy, inflation burns the house down. If they raise rates to save the dollar, the interest on the debt kills the government. The high priests are standing in a temple that is collapsing. The Nile has dried up. The magicians are human, and the math is God. The book is complete. The unmasking is total. A word from the author. The hope for a failed prophecy. If you have finished this book, and feel a sense of unease, then we have occupied the same headspace for a long time. Writing this has not been an act of doomsday excitement, or a desire to say, "I told you so." In fact, as I stand here in the spring of 2026, looking at the $39 trillion reality we have discussed in these 14 chapters, I want to say something that might sound strange coming from an author. I sincerely hope this book is wrong. I hope that the Joseph voice in these pages has misread the cycles. I hope the masked magician has missed a hidden trapdoor, some brilliant unforeseen innovation, or a global shift that allows the fat cows to keep grazing without the lean cows ever catching up. I hope that the $1 trillion annual interest payments somehow dissolve into the ether, and that the vanishing dollar finds its way back into your pocket with its full strength restored. Nothing would make me happier than to have this book sit on a dusty library shelf in 20 years, cited by future historians as a curious example of alarmist fiction that never came to pass. The burden of the watchman. However, there is a reason Joseph didn't tell Pharaoh a happy story. He didn't tell him what he wanted to hear, he told him what the silo was saying. The math of 2026 is not a matter of political opinion. It is a matter of forensic accounting. When the interest on our past becomes more expensive than the defense of our future, we are no longer talking about economic theories, we are talking about the laws of gravity. I wrote this book because I believe that truth is the only form of mercy. If a bridge is out a mile ahead, the man who screams "stop" isn't being negative. He is being the only friend you have. By unmasking the great fiscal illusion, my goal was not to spread fear but to provide agency. The purpose of the warning. If we are right about the debt bomb, then you are now equipped. You can see the invisible wires. You know why the prices at your grocery store are rising. You know that the magicians in the palace aren't coming to save your silo, because they are too busy trying to save their own stage. If this book is right, the famine is the great teacher that will force us back to reality, to production, and to real value. If I am wrong, then we have simply had a fascinating conversation about history and math, and your life continues as normal. But as the shortly of 2026 arrives, I ask you to look at the world around you, not through the lens of the evening news but through the lens of the silo. If the lean cows look real to you, then do not wait for the magicians to admit the show is over. Start planting. Start storing. Start believing in what is real. I hope I am wrong. But for your sake, I have written this as if I am right. Thank you for reading. Tony Egar. Brisbane, Australia. Introduction. The Mirror of the Watchman. We are living in an era of unprecedented noise. We are surrounded by experts, who speak in the polished jargon of the palace, telling us that $40 trillion in debt is a sign of strength, and that the shrinking of the American dream is merely a transition. But as we stand in the year 2026, the noise is no longer working. The audience is restless. The theater is cold. To understand the crisis we are currently breathing, we must look away from the politicians and the bankers. Instead, we must look toward two figures who, though separated by 3,000 years, were masters of the same craft, the unmasking of reality. The man from the prison, Joseph the auditor. In real life, the life recorded in the foundational texts of Western civilization, Joseph was the first man to perform a forensic audit on a superpower. He was not a priest or a politician, he was an outsider. After years in a dungeon, he was brought before Pharaoh to interpret a nightmare. Joseph's genius was his ability to see through the fat cows of the present. While Egypt was feasting, Joseph was calculating. He understood that prosperity is often a timed window, a gift meant to be stored rather than consumed. He didn't offer Pharaoh a stimulus plan. He offered a silo strategy. He was the man who saved an empire not by printing money, but by counting grain. He is the archetype of the truth-teller, who values the math more than the mood of the palace. The man from the stage, the masked magician. Fast forward to the modern era. In the world of entertainment, the masked magician became a cultural phenomenon for one reason: he broke the code of silence. He was a professional who stepped onto the stage to show the audience exactly how they were being fooled. He showed the trapdoors, the mirrors, and the invisible wires. He didn't do it to destroy the wonder of the show, but to empower the audience. He believed that once you see how the trick is done, you can no longer be a victim of the illusion. In this book, the masked magician represents the forensic analyst of the modern financial system. He is the one who knows how the Federal Reserve floats the debt, how the Treasury hides the inflation, and how the experts use jargon to keep you in your seat while they empty your granary. The unified voice, the forensic watchman. This book is a collision of these two spirits. We are bringing the ancient foresight of Joseph and the modern exposure of the masked magician, and unifying them into a single voice for the present. Why? Because America is currently trapped in a magic show that has turned into a nightmare. Like Pharaoh, our leaders have had dreams of lean cows, the warnings of 2008 and 2020. But unlike Pharaoh, our leaders did not listen to the man from the prison. They listened to the magicians. By unifying these voices, we create a perspective that is both timeless and immediate. Joseph provides the cycle, the 12-chapter movement of plenty to famine, while the masked magician provides the evidence, the unmasking of the 2026 debt tricks. Together, they form a forensic watchman. They stand before the reader not to sell a political party or a financial product,